In our last episode, we discussed the American people's insatiable drive to go west and its culmination in Louisiana Purchase. That event doubled the size of the country and stretched America's borders into the Rocky Mountains. But Americans continued to look further west, to lands beyond the Rockies. They dreamed of expanding what President Jefferson called the Empire of Liberty. Some even imagined the United States as a continental power stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. They fantasized about spreading liberty throughout the Western Hemisphere. Of course, there were many problems with this dream. The lands beyond the Louisiana Territory were populated by Native Americans, and those lands were claimed first by Spain and then by Mexico. And then there were the moral questions. After all, the United States was a republic. Do republics expand? Wouldn't expansion entail conquest? Do republics conquer territory? After all, the United States was based on the idea of the consent of the governed. Wouldn't conquest violate this principle? But what if conquering that territory was done in the name of liberty? What if expansion would bring freedom and opportunity to millions? And if that conquest happened, how would slavery figure in all this? That, in itself, was a whole other issue. We began with the issue of expansion in the last episode, but the expansion into Louisiana came from diplomacy. What if it came through war or the threat of war? In the years after Jefferson's administration, a new generation rose to American leadership. They inherited the ideals of the founding, as well as its contradictions and unresolved questions. In this episode, we will see how that generation rose to deal with that inheritance, especially with the issue of expansion. And we will specifically look at one man who, though largely forgotten and little understood, remains a giant in the annals of American history. That man, James K. Polk, and the war he waged, is the focus of this episode of This American President, the Great American Conqueror, Part 1. The Founding Fathers believed that America was the most blessed nation on earth. George Washington, in his first inaugural address, declared, quote, "No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency." There was this sense that because America was committed to humanity's highest ideals, it had been rewarded accordingly. Well, the decades just after the founding only served to confirm that notion in the eyes of millions of Americans. The United States was enjoying unprecedented peace and prosperity, and growing at breakneck speed. By the 1840s, the economy was expanding at about 4% every year, and its population was growing rapidly. In 1800, the total population in the United States was 5.3 million. By 1840, it had more than tripled to 17 million. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, completed under Thomas Jefferson's presidency, came just in time. It doubled the size of the country, giving the rising population with a seemingly endless supply of cheap land. This set off a scramble to settle on Western lands. With all of that said, you start getting a picture of where America was in the 1840s. It was an era of continuously increasing prosperity and possibility. The United States was seen as a rising giant. It was taking over an entire continent and had an economy that was beginning to rival Europe's. Of course, not everyone enjoyed the fruits of prosperity. Ever since Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793, slavery became more entrenched in Southern society. By 1840, 2.5 million, or about a fifth of the country's population, were slaves. And as more immigrants entered the country, like Catholics, more people in America didn't like them, so you start seeing what they call nativist sentiment. Still, things were going well for the country, and that also included politics. Yes, the country had faced threats in those years and even had its capital burned down by the British during the War of 1812. But that was more the exception than the rule. During those years, the nation's political landscape was so peaceful and unified that one party, Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party, won 7 straight presidential elections. Historians now refer to that time as the era of good feelings. It's hard to imagine a time of such relative political harmony, but it actually happened. One trend during this time was that the country was becoming more democratic. The Founding Fathers were not fans of democracy. Property requirements limited who could vote. And while certain citizens could vote for some local and state positions and their representatives in the U.S. House, they couldn't directly vote for many of their laws, for their senators, and for their president. But by the 1830s, that was changing. Voting requirements were being abolished, and more people could directly choose their leaders. And one man who symbolized this entire trend was Andrew Jackson. Few men in American history have ever captured the imagination or admiration of his fellow citizens as Jackson, who made a name for himself during the War of 1812. During that war, General Jackson defeated the Creek Indians, and in doing so secured 23 million acres of land for his countrymen. He then defeated the British in the Battle of New Orleans and secured the vital Mississippi River. In doing so, he confirmed America's possession of the Louisiana Territory. It has often been said that these military triumphs made him a national hero on par with George Washington. His immense popularity carried him to the presidency in 1829, where he would serve 2 terms as the leader of the Democratic Party. What made Jackson different was his identification with the common man. The Founding Fathers seemed like aloof aristocrats, but Jackson came from the people. He was tough, braving the same rigors as his soldiers. After all, he was nicknamed Old Hickory. He had a violent temper and remains famous today for the many duels he fought in, or the savage ways in which he attacked his enemies, whether they were Native Americans or politicians, and the American people loved him for it. Jackson's fiery personality dominated the American political landscape, so much so that he remains the only president to have an entire era named after him, the Jacksonian Era. During his presidency, Jackson's popularity earned him the staunch loyalty of his followers. After all, Jackson did usher in the spoils system, which rewarded supporters with lucrative government positions. But as important as Jackson was, he isn't the focus of this episode. Instead, we will focus on one of his major disciples, Tennessee Congressman James Knox Polk. Polk was a natural ally and protege to Andrew Jackson. Like Jackson, Polk was of Scotch-Irish descent, was born in the Carolinas, by then North Carolina, and moved to Tennessee. He was 28 years younger than Jackson, born in 1795, and was part of the generation that idolized Old Hickory. Ever since he was a child, Polk suffered from poor health. In fact, as a teenager, he underwent surgery to remove urinary stones. I read a little bit of what this was like, and I can safely say that I'm glad I've never had to experience it, especially since he was awake and only had brandy as an anesthetic. Although the surgery was successful, some historians believe it left him sterile, which would explain why he never had children. Anyway, Polk went to the University of North Carolina, where he realized he was quite good at debating and public speaking. After graduation, he went to Tennessee to study law and passed the Tennessee bar in 1820 at the age of 24. Polk soon got involved in public service. He began giving political speeches and impressed crowds with his oratorical skills, and was even given the nickname the Napoleon of the Stump. This led him to being elected in the Tennessee State Legislature in 1823 in just his early 20s. It was in this position that he voted for General Andrew Jackson for U.S. Senate. From then on, Polk dedicated much of his political career to furthering Jackson's career and principles. Polk's relationship with Jackson was more than political, it was personal. They were family friends from Tennessee, and some historians believe that Jackson encouraged him to court the woman who would become his wife, Sarah Childress. Polk married her in 1824 when he was 28 and she was 20. In the meantime, Polk continued to rise in Tennessee politics. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and took office in 1825 at the age of 29. When he moved to Washington, D.C., one of his roommates was fellow Tennessee Congressman Sam Houston. More on him later. Polk would serve in the House for 14 years. In 1828, Jackson was elected President of the United States. When Andrew Jackson took office, Polk was one of his closest allies in Congress, and his value to the president increased when he became chairman of the powerful Ways and Means Committee, and in 1835 as the Speaker of the House. He served in this position for 4 years until 1839. When Jackson's presidency ended in 1837, his vice president, Martin Van Buren, succeeded him. Polk continued to remain loyal to Van Buren and the Democratic Party. Although Jackson was widely popular, he was also controversial. He was the kind of guy you either loved or hated. The one-party rule of the era of good feelings gave way to the Jacksonian Democrats and the party that formed chiefly to oppose him, the Whigs. And the Whigs began to gain more support when an economic depression hit President Van Buren. Although Polk was the highest-ranking member of the House, he had higher ambitions and set his sights on executive office. In 1839, Polk ran for governor of Tennessee and defeated his Whig opponent by a thin margin. Governor Polk and his mentor, the retired Andrew Jackson, hoped that Polk would become the vice presidential nominee in 1840, and then president in 1844. Unfortunately for them, the Whigs were ascendant, blocking much of Polk's agenda. Polk failed to win the vice presidential nomination in 1840, and the Whigs captured the White House that year. Polk then ran for re-election as governor in 1841, and was defeated by a narrow margin. Out of office, Polk plotted a comeback. In 1843, Polk again ran for governor of Tennessee to reclaim the office, and again he was defeated. By 1844, James Polk, age 47, was a two-time loser and seemingly at the end of his career. He had been rejected by his fellow Tennesseans 2 elections in a row. So I'm going to pull back a bit so we can see the bigger picture. Back in 1840, President Van Buren ran for a second term. That year, the Whigs ran William Henry Harrison against Martin Van Buren, who, like Jackson, was a hero from the War of 1812. It was a smart move by the Whigs. Even though they hated Jackson, they ran someone like him. Due to the Depression and Harrison's appeal, he defeated Van Buren and became the first Whig to win the presidency. The Whigs finally knew how to win in the age of Jackson. To some, it looked like the Jacksonian era was over. But history threw a wrench into the Whigs' plans. You see, William Henry Harrison may have been a war hero, but he was also really old. 69 years old, the oldest ever elected at that time. I always thought it was amusing that America elected someone that old at a time when life expectancy was quite lower, like electing someone in their late 80s today. Indeed, 1 month after his inauguration, Harrison died of pneumonia in April 1841, becoming the first president to die in office. His vice president, John Tyler, ascended to the White House, and this really confused things. Although Tyler was on the Whig ticket, he was once a Democrat, but had left the party over his vehement opposition to Andrew Jackson. He ended up helping Henry Clay and Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster start the Whig Party. But as president, Tyler showed his maverick tendencies again and refused to go along with much of the Whig program. He vetoed Whig proposals to revive the national bank and increase the tariff. As a result, the Whigs censured him. Having burned bridges on both sides of the aisle, Tyler was now president without a party. Despite having won the 1840 election, the Whigs were unable to pass their agenda thanks to Harrison's death and Tyler's policies. These events made the 1844 election all the more important because it would decide if the Whigs could really get their program implemented. The Democrats feared that this would undo all of the gains they made during the Jackson years and hoped to reclaim the White House in 1844. But by then, their most popular vote-getter, Andrew Jackson, was in his late 70s and dying. Several Democrats aspired to the nomination, like Lewis Cass, who had served as Jackson's Secretary of War and as ambassador to France. There was James Buchanan, the moderate senator from Pennsylvania, who was once the U.S. minister to Russia. And there was John C. Calhoun, who had served as vice president under John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, and was a staunch defender of Southern interests. These men all aspired to be the leader of the Democrats in the post-Jackson age. But one man loomed over the rest of the party, former President Martin Van Buren. Although he had lost his re-election bid in 1840, he was hungry to return to the White House. As the 1844 election neared, Van Buren remained the heavyweight in the Democratic Party. Most observers believed the Democratic nomination was his for the taking. Several events would intervene to complicate Van Buren's bid for the nomination, and the biggest of these, appropriately, was Texas. To understand the situation in Texas, here's some background info. There was once a time when Spain ruled a massive chunk of North America. That chunk covered what is now the Rocky Mountains, California, Montana, the Dakotas, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, and Mexico. All of that was called New Spain. It's fascinating to think that much of the United States' best real estate today was once under Spain. When the United States acquired the massive Louisiana territory from Napoleon in 1803, it now had a huge border with Spanish territories, most of which was defined by the Mississippi River. But there was confusion about its exact boundaries in other places, like what is now Texas. The Americans claimed the Rio Grande as the border, which basically meant claiming all of modern-day Texas. The Spanish claimed the border was farther east of that. A stalemate ensued on the issue until 1819, when Secretary of State John Quincy Adams negotiated a treaty in which Spain gave Florida to the United States, but kept most of what is today Texas. Many U.S. citizens who hoped to settle in Spanish Texas were bitterly disappointed. They had hoped to make use of the vast tracts of land in Spanish Texas, which included fertile regions irrigated by many rivers. By this time, Spain had been in the New World since the 15th century and was declining in geopolitical strength. It was having a hard time hanging on to its overseas territories. In a blow to its imperial strength, Mexico won independence from Spain in 1821. At that moment, all that territory that comprised New Spain, the part that includes the present-day West Coast, Southwest, Midwest, and Texas, was now under the independent Republic of Mexico. Throughout this time, Presidents John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson did not dispute Mexico's claim over Texas, but they, like many Americans, salivated for it. Both Adams and Jackson sought multiple times through official and unofficial diplomatic channels to purchase Texas from the Mexican government. But Mexico was not willing to give up Texas. Even more frustrating to the Americans was that Mexico governed these vast lands incompetently. When it won independence, Mexico's first leader was Agustin de Iturbide, a military figure who declared himself emperor in 1822 and installed a corrupt autocracy. In less than a year, he was overthrown, but political instability continued. The First Mexican Republic, which lasted from 1824 to 1835, 11 years, saw 9 presidents, 2 triumvirates, and multiple coups. Although it adopted a constitution in 1824, it was replaced in 1836 by a more centralized government. In the first 30 years of an independent Mexico, only 1 president served a full term, while others were toppled and executed. All this instability alienated and disturbed those who lived in its vast territories to the north, those that comprise the present-day United States. And few Mexican citizens were actually populating those areas, like Texas. To many observers, Mexico was a stagnating, corrupt, unstable country, and it made for an unfavorable comparison with its neighbor, the dynamic United States. The country I described earlier that was growing in population, advancing technologically, and thriving economically. Just to give you an idea of the disparity between the United States and Mexico, consider the following. At the start of the 19th century, the United States economy was twice the size of Mexico's. By the middle of the century, it was 13 times greater. And in the 1790s, the United States population was around 4 million, while Mexico's was 5 million. By the 1840s, Mexico's had risen to 7 million, while the United States more than quadrupled to 17 million. So if you lived in the 19th century and the United States and Mexico were publicly owned companies, you'd probably be telling people to sell the Mexican stock and buy American stock. And for those who own Mexican stock, you'd probably consider it a waste. Well, that's how people felt when they saw the vast amounts of land owned by Mexico, lands they felt could be better put to use by Americans. As many Americans looked at Texas, they lamented the fact that this promising region was in the hands of an incompetent government that couldn't fully utilize its resources in the name of progress. If Mexico couldn't populate Texas itself, it could allow settlers into Texas to develop the land. In the 1820s, Mexico did just that, allowing U.S. citizens into Texas, so long as they converted to Catholicism and became Mexican citizens. Mexico did this for a few reasons. First, it hoped that it could benefit from the cotton produced by the settlers. And second, it hoped that the settlers would serve as a buffer zone against Native American attacks and the United States. One of those settlers was a man named Stephen F. Austin, who brought 300 families into Texas in 1825. In a few short years, the number of American settlers in Texas grew exponentially, mirroring the overall American movement into the West. This greatly concerned Mexico, which outlawed slavery and further U.S. settlement in Texas in 1830, but this did little to stem the tide. By the 1840s, about 150,000 Americans had settled in Texas, many of whom were slaveholders. Whenever I read about this phase in American history, I'm always struck by the irony of it all. I grew up in California, the state with the most Mexicans in the Union, and one of the hot spots in the debate on legal and illegal immigration. We all know that there are many people in the United States and Mexico with very strong opinions on this topic. But you have to acknowledge the irony that at one point in history, Americans were illegally entering Mexican territory to the dismay of Mexican citizens. At any rate, Mexico kept trying to stop the influx of whites into Texas and began a military occupation. White settlers began local uprisings against Mexican rule. In 1835, the president of Mexico, Antonio López de Santa Anna, took his army and marched into Texas to pacify the region and restore his country's authority. This provoked the Texas Declaration of Independence of March 1836. The following month, Texas General Sam Houston, James Polk's old congressional colleague, defeated Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. By June of 1836, Santa Anna acknowledged Texan independence. By October of that year, Sam Houston was elected the first president of the Republic of Texas. But Texas continued to feel insecure with its new status. Mexico was embittered by its defeat and refused to recognize the new republic. Many Texan citizens hoped that their new country would be annexed as a state to the United States. But American leaders remained wary. Then President Jackson was close friends with Sam Houston, and he supported Texan independence from Mexico. But he feared the division that would come if Texas entered the Union. You see, the annexation of Texas would add another slave state to the United States. In fact, Texas was so big that some believed it could be broken up into several states. If those states were annexed to the Union, the number of senators and representatives from slave states would tip the Congress strongly in favor of Southern interests. This would disturb the delicate balance between slave and free states, potentially provoking the northern states, perhaps leading into civil war. Jackson ended up recognizing Texas, but only at the very end of his presidency, so as to avoid making it an issue in the 1836 election. President Van Buren shared Jackson's fears of disunion. He also feared that annexing Texas could provoke Mexico to make war with the United States. In fact, when Texas sent a formal proposal for annexation in 1837, Van Buren rejected it. Multiple resolutions for annexing Texas were offered in the Congress, but they all fell through. Now, as I mentioned before, William Henry Harrison defeated Van Buren and took office in 1841. His death put John Tyler in the White House, but by 1843 his presidency was falling apart. As I said earlier, he was a man with no party, shunned by the political establishment, and with very little connection to the voters. So he knew that if he wanted to win re-election or salvage his presidential legacy, he had to do something big. And if you want to go big, is there any state more appropriate than Texas? Tyler came out in favor of Texas annexation, arguing that it would boost the American economy. But there was also another reason. None of this was occurring in a vacuum. Even though Great Britain and the United States had been at peace for about 30 years, London, as the world's superpower, was always making its presence felt. Britain still had possession of Canada and was now in talks with the Texas Republic. If an alliance could be forged with Texas, Britain could then threaten the United States from the north, through Canada, and the southwest, through Texas. And this was no idle threat. Remember, the British had burned down the American capital just a few decades earlier. American leaders had another reason to be concerned about Britain. Since it had abolished slavery in 1833, it had become more abolitionist. There were rumors that Britain was planning to provide a loan to Texas on the condition that it emancipated its slaves. This all immediately conjured up fears of disunion. Southern slaveholders were terrified of the idea of abolition happening so close. Some were also warning Tyler that Texas might rejoin Mexico, albeit with greater autonomy. Although many of these rumors were not confirmed, it spurred Tyler into action. By the fall of 1843, American officials were secretly meeting with Texas officials on annexation. Tyler turned to the most popular American at the time, the aging Andrew Jackson, for help. Since Jackson was close to Houston, he asked him to reach out to the Texas president to get him to rebuff Britain, France, and Mexico and support annexation to the U.S. Jackson did just that, arguing that Texas would prosper more as part of the Union than it would under Mexico or as an independent nation. It worked. Sam Houston now favored annexing Texas, his current nation, to the United States, his birth nation. By April 12, 1844, a treaty was signed joining Texas to the Union. The treaty also provided for 4 states to be carved out of Texas, 3 of which would likely be permitted as slave states. Now the treaty had to be ratified. Some worried that annexation would provoke Mexico to declare war on the United States since it hadn't recognized Texas and still considered it part of its own territory. The most divisive issue, of course, was slavery, but President Tyler hoped to head off this issue by arguing the treaty's overall benefits. He emphasized the overall economic benefits of annexation to the country as a whole and the fact that it would close off an avenue for British meddling. Unfortunately for Tyler, an incident would occur that would torpedo his plans. Tyler's Secretary of State was a man named John C. Calhoun, a staunch pro-slavery Southerner. On April 27, 1844, just 2 weeks after the treaty between Texas and the United States was signed, Calhoun wrote a letter to the British minister Richard Pakenham in which he stated that the United States' objective in annexing Texas was to protect Southern slavery from foreign meddling. He then praised slavery as a positive good. It was probably the worst thing that could have happened for Tyler. When the letter was exposed, the president's hopes to keep slavery out of the annexation debate were dashed. You can imagine the facepalms among those who favored annexation that happened all across the country. Now Northerners, whether Democrat or Republicans, felt pressure to oppose Texas annexation. This issue divided the nation in the run-up to the 1844 election and put many presidential candidates in a bind. There was a sense that annexation was popular, but what about the slavery issue? And would annexation lead to war with Mexico? The ailing Andrew Jackson came out in support of annexation, saying that it would expand American liberty and secure us from Great Britain. Whig leader Henry Clay, the guy Jacksonians accused of the corrupt bargain back in 1824, was almost certainly planning a run in 1844, and he came out against annexation. He voiced the views of many Americans who believed that Texas would become American eventually anyways, by virtue of demographics. Why move so quickly to annex and provoke war with Mexico when we could just wait it out and take Texas without going to war? And a second argument also resonated with many Americans, that annexation would amount to conquest. And conquest was something that America does not and should not do. Quote, it would proclaim to the world an insatiable and unquenchable thirst for foreign conquest or acquisition of territory. All eyes were on Van Buren, the front-runner for the Democratic nomination. Many of his fellow Democrats supported annexation, including his mentor Andrew Jackson. But, being a New Yorker, many of his fellow Northerners opposed adding another slave state. When Van Buren announced his position, it was a massive disappointment to Jackson and many of his fellow partisans. He joined the Whig Clay in opposing annexation. He agreed with Clay that it would provoke a war with Mexico, and that it smacked of unjust conquest. Quote, it has hitherto been our pride and our boast that, whilst the lust of power has led other and differently constituted governments to aggression and conquest, our movements in these respects have always been regulated by reason and justice. On May 1st, 1844, Henry Clay won the Whig nomination for President of the United States. Americans now knew that at least one of its major presidential candidates was anti-annexation. The question was, would the Democrats give America the option of a pro-annexation candidate? After all, Van Buren was the favorite. Now let's go back to Polk. As I said earlier, he had risen to Speaker of the House and Governor of Tennessee. But he was fresh off of 2 straight election losses. To many, his career was effectively over. But Polk had a quiet, unassuming confidence in his own abilities. Despite his defeats, he still aspired to higher office. He didn't have the stature of Jackson, Van Buren, or Calhoun. so the presidential nomination was probably out of question for now. But maybe not the vice presidency. Being a former speaker and governor surely made the vice presidency a possibility. And he was distinguishing himself from Van Buren and Clay as an unequivocal supporter of annexation. In April 1844, he wrote, quote, "I have no hesitation in declaring that I am in favor of immediate re-annexation of Texas." In 1844, as Polk pondered his political future, he received an invitation to visit his mentor, former President Jackson, at his home in Nashville. When he arrived, he discovered Jackson to be highly disappointed with Van Buren's anti-annexation stance. He then proposed to Polk that he run for president. Polk was an ambitious man, but he also knew enough about politics to be a realist. He doubted he could take down his more famous rivals, and he also felt that, as a Southerner from Tennessee, he would be unacceptable to the Northerners supporting Van Buren. But the fact that Jackson, the most successful American political figure of the age, was now touting his candidacy might be an indication of his viability. The Democratic National Convention began a couple of weeks later at the end of May 1844. During the balloting, Van Buren, Calhoun, and Lewis Cass simply could not muster a two-thirds majority. For Van Buren, his anti-annexation stance proved the death knell for his candidacy. The search for a compromise candidate ensued. James K. Polk was that man. Despite having failed in his two previous bids at public office, Polk's pro-annexation stance resonated with the delegates, and Polk remained loyal to the president he once served, Martin Van Buren. Of all the pro-annexation candidates, they found Polk the most acceptable. And of course, Polk had the backing of former President Andrew Jackson. After 9 ballots, James Polk ran away with the nomination, winning all 266 delegates. Just weeks before, Polk was at the bottom of his career, with long-shot hopes for the vice presidential nod. Now he was the Democratic nominee for the highest office in the land. Historians consider James Polk the first dark horse presidential candidate. Who is James K. Polk? His opponents asked disparagingly. His opponent, Henry Clay, was one of the most formidable political figures of the age. While Polk was just 49 years old by 1844, Clay was 67. Clay had had a long career as a congressman, a senator, and as a Secretary of State. He had also been the Democratic nominee for president twice, losing both times. Like Polk, Clay had served as Speaker of the House, but unlike Polk, he had had many visible legislative successes. Some saw Clay on par with Andrew Jackson in terms of national importance. It has often been said that politics during the Jacksonian era was a long political duel between Jackson and Clay. Indeed, Jackson and Clay hated each other with a passion that rivaled any feud in American history. Clay once said of Jackson, quote, "He is ignorant, passionate, hypocritical, corrupt, and easily swayed by the basest men who surround him." For his part, Jackson described Clay as, quote, "certainly the basest, meanest scoundrel that ever disgraced the image of God, reckless and as full of fury as a drunken man in a brothel." If you think politics is nasty now, just read more of these guys' letters. In 1832, these two political titans faced off in the presidential election. Jackson ended up winning in a landslide. Now, in 1844, Clay was the Whig presidential nominee for a third time, facing Jackson's protege. By then, Clay's place in American history was secure, but he had one final goal left unfulfilled, the White House. But like Van Buren, Clay's opposition to annexation was an albatross hanging from his neck, and the issue became more heated and muddled when the annexation treaty died in the Senate on June 8, 1844. The issue posed a big threat to Democrat hopes. While the Whigs were united against the annexation, the Democrats remained split. Polk needed to do something to unify his Democratic rivals like Lewis Cass behind him. He knew that they had little reason to support him. After all, if he won, they would be frozen out for another run for the presidency, since Polk would presumably run for re-election in 1848. But if he lost, they would have a chance to run as the nominee in 1848. So Polk made a gambit to ensure their support. On June 12th, Polk announced that if elected, he would only serve one term. It was a risky but shrewd move, making him more acceptable to the different factions of the Democratic Party. Henry Clay had a feeling that annexation was popular, so he began to walk back on his opposition. But in doing so, he appeared to be flip-flopping. And he was also hampered by a third-party candidate, James Burney, who ran on a firm anti-slavery platform. On Election Day, Burney served as a spoiler, splitting off northern votes away from Clay. Polk defeated Clay by a small margin, 49.5% to 48.1% in the popular vote, and 170 to 105 in the Electoral College. Henry Clay had lost his third bid for the presidency, and James K. Polk would become the 11th president of the United States. Once again, the Jacksonians had frustrated the Whigs. Clay and his party had misjudged just how pro-annexation the country was. Thanks to William Henry Harrison's death and the Texas issue, the Whigs missed a major historical opportunity to implement their agenda. Some Whigs took an elitist perspective on the results. The pro-Whig National Intelligencer wrote that, quote, the larger portion of the educated and informed people of the land voted for Clay, and a much larger portion of those neither educated nor well-informed voted for their successful opponents. For Andrew Jackson himself, inching ever closer to death, his protégé's victory had secured his legacy for posterity. Quote, I can say in the language of Simeon of old, Jackson said, now let thy servant depart in peace, for I have seen the solution of the liberty of my country and the perpetuity of our glorious cause. By the way, this brings us to an interesting point. I often find it amusing when people are shocked by the results of a presidential election. In most elections, there is a presumptive favorite, the person that most people expect will win the election. Oftentimes, that person has more experience than his or her opponent. But on election night, the unexpected might happen, and sometimes the underdog wins. And everyone seems utterly shocked by the results. Well, it happened in 1844, and it happened several other times in history. And this, I believe, is how history can be instructive to us. Always expect the unexpected, especially in politics. At any rate, President-elect Polk began filling in his cabinet, and there are two people that are most notable here. The first was his Secretary of State, James Buchanan, from Pennsylvania, 53 years old. Buchanan was a strong Jacksonian who had served as a congressman and senator, and at one point was Jackson's minister to Russia. Although he was not a Southerner, he often sided with them against the Northerners, especially the abolitionists, when it came to states' rights and slavery, and he was in favor of American expansion and the annexation of Texas. And everyone knew that Buchanan had presidential ambitions. He had hoped he could emerge as a compromise candidate in 1844, and as we shall see, those ambitions would be the source of much friction between Polk and his senior cabinet officer. The second was Secretary of War William L. Marcy from New York, 58 years old. Marcy, another strong Jacksonian, had served as a senator and the governor from the Empire State. Like Buchanan, Marcy was a Northerner whose views aligned more with the South. As abolitionism rose in the North, Marcy was among the Northerners who favored working with rather than provoking Southern politicians. As the Secretary of War, Polk was entrusting Marcy with carrying out his orders as Commander-in-Chief. Although Polk was looking ahead to taking office, Tyler was still in the White House, and he stayed busy to secure his legacy by annexing Texas. Although the treaty had died in the Senate the previous June, Tyler remained undaunted. He argued that Polk's election was a mandate to annex Texas. Then President Tyler came up with a solution. Instead of trying to pass a treaty with the necessary two-thirds majority, why not just get the Congress, meaning both the House and the Senate, to pass a resolution annexing Texas? The resolution would have to be accepted by Texas, but at least it wouldn't need the supermajority in the Congress. So from here until Polk's inauguration, a series of intense negotiations occurred on the Texas issue, one that exposed the increasing divide between Northerners and Southerners, between those for and against slavery. Representative Milton Brown pushed for a pro-slavery plan, creating 5 states out of Texas's western region, all of which could enter as slave states. Again, this would increase the number of slave states represented in Congress. Since the Democrats held a strong majority in the House, it passed along party lines. In the Senate, Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri proposed a compromise on February 5, 1845, to sidestep the slavery issue. It specified that a bipartisan commission of 5 be formed to resolve all issues related to Texas annexation, like slavery and the final border with Mexico. Benton insisted that the implementation of the plan be left to Polk. Being a former speaker, President-elect Polk decided to jump into the fray and began meeting with both factions. And this is where you see Polk's skill as a political operator. In separate sets of meetings, Polk gave both sides the impression he was on their side. Those in favor of the pro-slavery plan in the House believed that Polk, being a Southern slaveholder, would support them. Those supporting Benton's compromise in the Senate, including Benton himself, believed that Polk would support them. In satisfying both sides, Polk obtained enough support for the resolution. It passed the House and the Senate by late February. President Tyler signed the joint resolution into law on May 1, 1845. Now, Benton and his supporters were under the impression that Tyler would sign the resolution but leave the implementation to Polk. But when the moment came, Tyler didn't want to leave all the credit to his successor. On his last day in office, March 3rd, Tyler sent to Mexico the resolution for their approval, but only with the terms set by the pro-slavery Brown Plan, while completely ignoring those set by Benton's plan. When President-elect Polk was told of Tyler's action, he quietly went along with it, perhaps because it would spare Polk the political controversy of appointing the commissioners. When Benton and his supporters found out that his plan was not included in the resolution sent to Texas, he was, to say the least, enraged. He was quoted saying, "This was Texas incorporated into the Union by a deception and by diluting 5 senators out of their votes." After Polk took office, he did nothing to recall the dispatch to Texas. In fact, Polk encouraged Texans to accept the resolution unconditionally. When Benton later accused Polk of reneging on what had been agreed, he replied, quote, "If any such pledges were made, it was in total misconception of what I said or meant." Regardless, Texas annexation was in full swing on terms set by Southern slaveholders. Many historians have credited Polk with his shrewd actions behind the scenes for unifying the Democrats behind the resolution. Others have criticized his duplicity towards the Benton faction or his pandering to the pro-slavery wing of the party. But it was a sign of things to come. James K. Polk, the incoming president, was a man of enormous competence and ambition, a man focused solely on results, whatever the consequences may be. At the age of 49, James Polk was the youngest man to become president up to that time. And his youth in many ways mirrored the exuberance of the country he was leading. Historians often say that Polk had 4 goals for his administration. First, he wanted to obtain an agreement with Britain on the Oregon Territory. Second, he wanted to acquire California from Mexico. Third, he wanted to reduce the tariff. And fourth, he wanted to create an independent treasury. As important as all these goals were, I'll focus on the former 2 goals rather than the latter 2, as they more closely relate to the theme I am exploring. And that theme is expansion. Polk was sworn in as the nation's 11th president on March 4, 1845, on the east portico of the U.S. Capitol. It was the first presidential inauguration to be reported by telegraph. As he spoke, Polk lauded the impending annexation of Texas. Quote, "The Republic of Texas has made known her desire to come into our Union, to form a part of our Confederacy, and enjoy with us the blessings of liberty secured and guaranteed by our Constitution. I congratulate my country that by an act of the late Congress of the United States, the assent of this government has been given to the reunion, and it only remains for the 2 countries to agree upon the terms to consummate an object so important to both. To Texas, the reunion is important, because the strong protecting arm of our government will be extended over her, and the vast resources of her fertile soil and genial climate would be speedily developed, while the safety of New Orleans and of our whole southwestern frontier against hostile aggression, as well as the interests of the whole Union, would be promoted by it." Here you see Polk arguing plainly that America had a right to Texas, in part because of its ability to exploit her resources better than anyone else. I've heard some academics argue that America is a country that talks about ideals, but in actuality operates for its own self-interest. They might be surprised to see an American president agreeing with them and saying so plainly. What those accusing America of hypocrisy often miss is that many of its leaders saw no contradiction between promoting America's ideals as well as its interests, and believed that pursuing those interests was a morally good thing to do. It was part of the idea that America could best promote human progress and prosperity. But Polk also brought up that Texas would form a buffer zone for New Orleans and its southwestern frontier. In fact, Polk argued further that acquiring Texas would be more conducive to peace. Quote, "None can fail to see the danger to our safety and the future peace if Texas remains an independent state or becomes an ally or dependency of some foreign nation more powerful than herself. Is there one among our citizens who would not prefer perpetual peace with Texas to occasional wars, which so often occur between bordering independent nations? Is there one who would not prefer free intercourse with her to high duties on all our products and manufactures which enter her ports or cross her frontiers? Is there not one who would not prefer an unrestricted communication with her citizens to the frontier obstructions which must occur if she remains out of the Union?" For Polk, annexation of territory was an economic, moral, and national security issue. With all of this said, one statement in his inaugural address stood out, and it involved an issue I've mentioned in passing. Quote, "It is my duty to assert and maintain by all constitutional means the right of the United States to that portion of our territory which lies beyond the Rocky Mountains. Our title to the country of Oregon is clear and unquestionable, and already our people are preparing to perfect that title by occupying it with their wives and children." The key phrase here is, quote, "Our title to the country of Oregon is clear and unquestionable." These words sent alarm bells across the Atlantic, and to understand why, here's another brief history lesson. When President Polk mentioned Oregon, he didn't just mean the area that presently described the state of Oregon. It encompassed the entire state, but much more. It basically included a huge section of the American Northwest, all of present-day Washington state, Oregon and Idaho, and parts of Montana and Wyoming. But that wasn't all. It also included lands that formed the present-day Canadian province of British Columbia. If you're familiar with latitude, its southern boundary was at the 42-degree line, and its northern boundary was at the 5440 line. Its western boundary was the Pacific coast, and its eastern boundary was marked by the Rocky Mountains. It was an enormous chunk of land covering 360,000 square miles. With its relatively mild climate, the area featured some of the most fertile valleys and plains, marked by navigable harbors and rivers, and a seemingly endless supply of timber. And it also featured a thriving fur trade. If you wanted in on the fur trade, this was the place to be. Ever since the 1500s, the Oregon country was primarily explored by four empires: Britain, France, Spain, and Russia. But in time, Russia was generally confined above the 56-degree latitude line into Alaska. By the 18th century, Britain and Spain were the dominant powers in Oregon, with both laying claims to various patches of land, some of which overlapped. By the 1790s, Britain and Spain came to an agreement, jointly administering the Oregon country and allowing its subjects with free access to land not already settled. It was at that time that the newly independent United States began exploring the region. American Captain Robert Gray discovered the Columbia River, which was and is the largest river in the region. In 1805, the Lewis and Clark expedition reached the Oregon country. In the years after the United States acquired the Louisiana Territory in 1803, it began making claims to the Oregon country. And in 1819, Spain, sensing its own weakness, gave up its claim to Oregon to the United States. So from 1819 on, the region was administered jointly, not by Britain and Spain, but by Britain and the United States. Well, as you may recall, the United States and Britain had a pretty nasty divorce during the American Revolution, and they went to war again in 1812. Although they were at peace, neither side completely trusted the other, so the joint occupation in Oregon was a tenuous one, especially when it involved valuable land and seacoast. And for many Americans who lived through the British invasions during the Revolution and in 1812, they feared that Oregon could serve as one of several points with which to threaten the American Republic. This is the element I often think is missing in historical analyses. It's easy to attack America for wanting to expand. And there may be some fair arguments here. But I think it's important to remember that for many Americans, the very presence of a foreign empire in the Western Hemisphere conjured up memories of invasion and military occupation. And oftentimes, these foreign powers would incite Native Americans against white settlers, although the violence there often went both ways. Either way, many Americans believed that the best way to secure their country was to clear the continent of any foreign claims to territory. It's why Jefferson sought and succeeded in purchasing the massive Louisiana Territory. It's why Jackson invaded Spanish Florida, and it's why many Americans wanted to get Britain out of Oregon. Whether the methods used for each of these acquisitions were correct will forever be debated, and from many other people's perspectives, it was the United States that threatened them. But I do think we do more justice to history when we remember the threat that foreign empires posed to the Western Hemisphere. When President Polk declared in his inaugural address, quote, "Our title to the country of Oregon is clear and unquestionable," he was telling the world that he wanted Britain out of the Northwest. And don't forget what I mentioned earlier, the dream of expanding American liberty and prosperity over a larger section of the continent. For many, the logical conclusion of that dream was the United States as a transcontinental power. In their eyes, what could be better for the North American continent and for the world for a thriving empire of liberty that reached from the Atlantic to the Pacific? And if Polk had any more reason to claim Oregon, American settlers in that region were getting restless. They were coming in droves and were the vast majority in Oregon, but they felt insecure settling on territory that was jointly claimed by the British and the Americans. Before long, they began writing back to the East Coast, expressing their hope that the United States would guarantee their protection. Of course, Britain was not pleased by Polk's declaration in Oregon. British Prime Minister Robert Peel responded that his nation had the, quote, "clear and unquestionable right to the territory," and that, quote, "if our rights are invaded, we are resolved and prepared to maintain them." Many of Polk's opponents echoed this criticism, saying that Polk was provoking war with a superpower. One person who remained undaunted was the dying Andrew Jackson, who, in typical Jacksonian style, wrote that, quote, "This is the rattling of British drums to alarm the timid and give strength to the traitors in our country against our best interest and growing prosperity. No temporizing with the British on this subject now. War is a blessing compared to national degradation." During the 1844 election, two sides formed on the Oregon issue. There were those Americans who wished to claim pretty much all of the Oregon Territory, up to the 5440 line. Others wanted to compromise with Britain somewhere in between, perhaps at the 49th parallel, which forms the present border between Canada and Washington state. Contrary to misperception, Polk never campaigned to acquire up to the 5440 line, and while he talked pretty big during his inaugural address, he was actually among those who desired a compromise with the British Empire. He and Buchanan had received word through a back channel that British Foreign Minister Aberdeen was interested in a compromise. Polk and Buchanan sent a letter to British Minister Pakenham indicating their own desire to compromise. But Pakenham rejected the letter and didn't bother sending it to his superiors in London, angering Polk and Buchanan. America would have to wait on Oregon. Meanwhile, Mexico soon got word of America's resolution to annex Texas. Since it continued to consider Texas a rebel province, Mexico believed this to be an act of aggression, perhaps the equivalent to a foreign invasion. On March 28, 1845, Mexico's foreign minister, Luis Cuevas, wrote to America's ambassador, Wilson Shannon, that annexation was, quote, "as offensive to Mexico as it is derogatory to the honor of the American Union," and cut off diplomatic relations. Cuevas then added, the United States, quote, "usurped a portion of territory which belongs to Mexico by a right which she will maintain at whatever cost." When these words reached the United States, many American citizens felt that war was becoming inevitable between the North American republics. Things got more tense when, on June 23, 1845, Texas accepted the U.S. Congress's joint resolution annexing Texas to the United States. By July, a Texas convention unanimously accepted annexation. Texas was on its way to becoming a U.S. state. Now, I've mentioned Mexico's political instability and autocracy, but there was more to all of this. Most accounts portray this era as a time of unmitigated American expansion at the expense of Mexico. In some ways, this is a fair portrayal. but it ignores the complexities of the relationship between the two countries. First, there is the long history between the ethnic groups that compose them. America, by and large, descended from the Anglo-Saxons, many of whom were Protestant and came from religious freedom. The Mexicans were a mix of Native American and Spanish blood, and were overwhelmingly Catholic. The Anglo-Saxons had a long history of egalitarianism and constitutional rights, linking all the way back to the Magna Carta in England. The Mexicans inherited a far more rigid political and economic social structure. The rivalry between the Anglo-Saxons and the Spanish in the New World was, in some ways, an extension of the rivalry in the Old World between Protestants and Catholics, between Elizabethan England and Imperial Spain, in which the turning point was the English defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. And to many Americans, the Spanish represented autocratic forces that wished to turn the clock back against human liberty. Second, the popular narrative ignores the many legitimate grievances the United States had against its erstwhile neighbor. The United States was the first country to recognize Mexican independence, and they both signed treaties of friendship. But it is a fact that American diplomats or citizens, as well as British subjects and French citizens who passed through Mexico, were often abused, kidnapped, impressed into servitude, or tossed into prison without due process. Some were even killed. Rogue Mexican vessels seized American ships and made away with its cargo. Dozens of these incidents occurred during the Jackson administration, and some were clamoring either for war or some form of reprisal. It may seem surprising to many that President Jackson counseled prudence, saying, quote, "We should act with both wisdom and moderation by giving to Mexico one more opportunity to atone for the past before we take redress into our own hands." Although he and many Americans believed they had sufficient justification to go to war. In 1839, under President Van Buren, the United States and Mexico set up a joint board, an arbitrator, to settle these disputes, but Mexico conducted herself dishonorably, often turning in incomplete information and employing delaying tactics. The board found Mexico liable for 20 payments, but Mexico stalled in paying them. By the time Polk entered office, Mexico had only paid off 3 of them, and new claims were piling up. One source says that the total number of claims was about 1.5 million in 1839 numbers, which is about 38 million in today's numbers. Now, I say all this not to say that American foreign policy during this time was perfect, but I say it to give a far more complete picture of the situation, because, quite frankly, I never learned about this side of the story. Whatever one can say about American conduct during this time, the Mexican Republic was not winning anyone over, or doing herself any favors. Her instability, her stagnation, and her inability or unwillingness to end violence against American or other foreign citizens over several years led others to build up long lists of grievances. Many Americans doubted that, with Mexico's poor financial state, it could ever pay back those claims, and with many Americans salivating over Mexico's northern territories, they felt that seizing those lands would be the only compensation their country could obtain. That's how President Polk felt. All things seemed to be coming together. He was on the verge of taking Texas, and he hoped he could negotiate with Britain to fully acquire Oregon, or at least part of that territory. But there was also another possibility. Remember when I mentioned that Polk wanted to acquire the Mexican territory of California? Well, this now fit even better with his overall plans. To do so would make America a truly coastal nation. It would allow an American presence near the Oregon country, bolstering its bargaining position with Britain. And let's not forget just how lucrative California was. It had vast amounts of glorious real estate. If the Oregon country had good weather, the California weather was perfect. And with its harbors, it was the gateway to trade with Asia. Besides, just like Texas, Mexico didn't have the resources to adequately govern California, nor did it have enough settlers there. In fact, Americans were settling California just as they had done in Texas and Oregon. Like Texas, many Americans felt that California could prosper under the United States, but would languish under Mexico. With all of that said, Polk, just weeks into his presidency, set off on an aggressive plan to pressure Mexico. He didn't want war over Texas, but he hoped that a show of force could get Mexico on the bargaining table. From there, Polk hoped Mexico would be willing to give up California, perhaps as compensation for the many unpaid claims it owed the United States. And remember, to Polk, this was a form of charity, since he, and many Americans felt, justifiably, that they had the pretext to make war or impose some form of punishment for its bad behavior. So in the summer of 1845, Polk sent a force into the Texas border, into disputed territory, past the Nueces River and next to the Rio Grande. And he sent a fleet to the Gulf of Mexico. Both forces were told essentially not to initiate any action, but to respond to any attack with, quote, the most prompt and energetic measures. But if Mexico did cross the Rio Grande, the U.S. was to consider the move an act of war. The fleet was commanded by Commodore David Connor, and the force near the Rio Grande was headed by Brevet Brigadier General Zachary Taylor. Now, Zachary Taylor is another interesting figure of note. If you have a chance, Google image him. If you do, you'll probably see a very gruff-looking man, someone with leathery skin and unkempt hair. Well, that was Zachary Taylor. By that time, he was in his 60s, and he was the kind of person who, when people saw him, they would think, man, that guy's had a rough life. He had, in my opinion, one of the best nicknames in American history, Old Rough and Ready. Taylor came from a prominent planter family in Virginia and had served in the military 37 years. By 1845, he was a veteran of the War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, and the Seminole War. He was the man that Polk entrusted with the delicate situation on the Texas border. Polk's assertive words and actions so soon into his presidency sparked a debate in his cabinet, in the U.S. Capitol, and across the nation. And that debate centered on what to do about Texas and Oregon. Behind both situations loomed the specter of war, either with Mexico or Britain or both. Some believe Polk's decision to move Taylor into disputed territory itself was an invasion of Mexico. Many feared that Polk was getting us into a two-front war, one war with Mexico and another with Britain, that could destroy the young republic, a very reasonable fear. Others, just like in Texas, argued that with Americans settling in the West, especially in California and Oregon, we had no reason to threaten Mexico and Britain. We could just wait it out and allow demographics to run its course. That way, those territories could become ours without war. All we had to do was be patient. But Polk still hoped for a diplomatic solution. On September 16, 1845, Polk decided to send an envoy, Congressman John Slidell, to Mexico to negotiate. Polk instructed him to offer anywhere from $14 to $40 million to purchase a huge amount of Mexican territory, which, today, would encompass California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. It was an ambitious move by Polk. If he could do it, he would expand the United States by a third. Polk believed that Mexico would be willing to settle because America was clearly the stronger of the two powers, and that, through its actions, it was demonstrating a willingness to use force. He felt that these factors, plus the fact that Polk was prepared to offer compensation, would convince Mexico of the hopelessness of the war. And maybe at this point, Mexico should have settled, because the odds of her beating the U.S. were low. Despite Polk's best efforts, Mexico was not planning to cower before America. In fact, Mexican President José Joaquín de Herrera was actually boosting his military posture and appointed a man named Anastasio Bustamante as commander of the army, a man who was itching for a fight. While all of this was going on, Polk was debating how to respond to Pakenham's rejection of his offer for Oregon. Polk wanted to maintain a tough line on Britain. He decided he would accept nothing less than the 49th parallel, a compromise position since others wanted him to go for the 5440 line. But Polk would still see how much he could get up to the 5440. But Secretary of State Buchanan feared that taking a tough line on Britain would force a confrontation, perhaps leading to war. As things were heating up with Mexico, Buchanan sided with those who feared a two-front war. Polk was betting that, like Mexico, Britain wanted to compromise. Polk explained how he would deal with Britain, saying, quote, "The only way to treat John Bull is to look at him straight in the eye." He argued that if we hesitated, Britain would, quote, "immediately become more arrogant and more grasping in his demands." This issue, like the situation in Mexico, began dividing the nation. And these divisions crossed party lines, especially since there was the possibility of war with two countries at the same time. Some Southerners were supportive of war with Mexico, hoping to claim its territories for the extension of slavery. But some of those same Southerners feared war with Britain, not just because of the prospect of defeat, but because of their interest in the cotton trade with Britain. Of course, many Northerners feared the extension of slavery would threaten their own financial interests too. John C. Calhoun, usually a staunch supporter of Southern interests, took a moderate tone, coming out in support of a compromise at the 49th parallel. To some, anything more than the 49th would be an act of aggression by America against Britain. To others, anything less than the 54-40 line was treason to the United States and an invitation for Britain to reestablish its empire in North America. Here's how Democrat Senator Edward A. Hannigan described his view on a compromise. Quote, "If it is rashness in the representatives of the people to assert the rights of the country, and if this rashness should produce war, and for which I shall be held responsible, I, for one, do not fear the responsibility. No compromise at 49. The people in this country would never consent to such a surrender." Hannigan said that if Polk compromised, quote, "So long as one human eye remains to linger on the page of history, the story of his abasement will be read, sending him and his name altogether to an infamy so profound and damnation so deep that the hand of resurrection will never be able to drag him forth. He who is a traitor to his country can never have the forgiveness of God." Democrat Congressman Leonard Sims echoed Hannigan's statements, saying, quote, "I am for the whole of Oregon, and in defense of it, I will willingly see every river from its mountain source to the ocean reddened with the blood of the contest." So back to Mexico. Polk's envoy John Slidell arrived in Mexico City on December 6, 1845. Although President Herrera was not totally against compromise, anti-American sentiment was strong in Mexico, and his government was in danger of being overthrown if he compromised at all with the United States. Slidell knew this and believed that compromise was becoming more unlikely. Then on December 20th, the Mexican government told Slidell that they would not receive him. And the reason was that to receive Slidell was to declare that U.S.-Mexican relations were back to normal, something that Mexico couldn't accept since America was attempting to annex Texas. This really ticked off Slidell, who saw this as a step towards war. At this time, Slidell wrote, quote, "If war, unfortunately, should be the result, the fault will not be with the United States. The sole responsibility of such a calamity, with all its consequences, must rest with the Mexican Republic." Within days, two events would further lead both countries into war. The first was Polk signing the resolution to annex Texas on December 28, 1845. Texas was now part of the United States. The second was the overthrow of President Herrera and the rise of conservative Mariano Paredes on January 3, 1846. For the United States, this meant that an anti-American government was in charge and completely unwilling to negotiate. And as further proof of the Mexican government's instability, yet another constitution was being drafted. So back to Oregon. While Americans were debating just what to do, Britain was undergoing important changes that would have an impact on the other side of the Atlantic. Britain was shifting from its longtime protectionist policies towards greater free trade. The government of Prime Minister Robert Peel led this effort, but it was a risky move that made uncertain his hold on power. He couldn't afford a protracted struggle over free trade as well as Oregon, so he started considering settling the matter with the United States. By the summer of 1846, Britain submitted a proposal that called for compromise at the 49th parallel. Polk and most of his cabinet were pleased with it, but strangely, Secretary of State Buchanan was against it. Remember when he feared Polk was taking too tough a line and was provoking war? Well, now Buchanan changed his tune and was pushing for taking the whole of Oregon up to the 54-40 line. This dramatic change of heart stunned President Polk, but Polk knew what Buchanan was up to. As I said earlier, it was clear to many that Buchanan had hopes for the 1848 presidential election. For Polk, this was a turning point. After this incident, Polk wrote, quote, "I cannot rely upon his honest and disinterested service." From then on, a tension would pervade the relationship between the President and the Secretary of State for the remainder of the term. Although the debate had been heated in the Senate, most Americans were with Polk on the matter. In June, the Senate ratified the compromise at the 49th parallel. Oregon was now America's alone. It was a major triumph for the Polk administration. In just over a year, the United States had grown dramatically in size, first by acquiring Texas, and second by acquiring Oregon. In both territories, the U.S. had secured highly lucrative territory. And now, Britain had less space to threaten the United States. The United States could now breathe a sigh of relief. The fear of a two-front war was fading away. But things remained tense with Mexico. And here we see the entrance, or rather, the return, of one of the most interesting and ridiculous men in history. I mentioned him in passing earlier. His name was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, and he had been the president of Mexico. It was his autocratic policies that led to the Texas Revolution in the first place, and it was he who Sam Houston personally defeated to obtain Texas independence. Since then, Santa Anna had been deposed and exiled in Havana, Cuba. To give you an idea of Santa Anna's personality, he once lost a leg in battle and had it buried with full military honors. Yes, he had his leg buried with full military honors. He was also someone who changed positions without any sense of shame. Back in the 1810s and 20s, he at various times opposed but then supported Mexican independence from Spain, depending on which side was winning. With all of that said, Santa Anna also happened to be the dominant figure in Mexican politics during this time. Although he suffered massive defeats as a soldier and as a political figure, time and again he found a way to return to power, ultimately serving as president 11 non-consecutive times over 22 years. As war loomed, the exiled Santa Anna sensed an opportunity for a comeback. Back in February 1846, a Mexican colonel named Alejandro Atocha met with President Polk at the White House. Atocha told Polk that Santa Anna was friendly with the new Mexican president Paredes, who might give him the chance to make a comeback. If Santa Anna could be restored to power, he would be willing to negotiate with the United States and sell much of what Polk wanted, land from Texas and California, for about $30 million. There was, of course, a catch. Atocha said that to make the deal, Mexican leaders needed cover. They had to look like they were forced to give up the territory, not that they were doing so willingly. Otherwise, with anti-Americanism widespread among the population, whichever Mexican government was in charge would be overthrown. So according to Atocha, Santa Anna was advising Polk to take more aggressive military actions. And Atocha also asked for about $500,000 for Mexico so it could keep its government regime until Santa Anna returned. Now this is where you have to love Santa Anna. Many historians seem to credit Atocha for acting on behalf of Santa Anna. Either way, it was a fascinating moment of intrigue. Either Atocha and Santa Anna, or Atocha alone, were willing to commit treason against their country, or they were trying to swindle the Americans, specifically the president himself. Or maybe it was a little bit of both. Polk wasn't quite sold, but according to some historians, was intrigued by the prospect of avoiding war through negotiations, backhanded they may be. By this time, Polk had learned of Mexico's rejection of Slidell. After years of grievances, this was yet another outrage. Polk and his cabinet decided to take things up a notch. They would demand Slidell be received, as well as for Mexico to make reparation payments. If Mexico refused, Polk would go to Congress to get authorization to, quote, take redress into our own hands by aggressive measures. Polk hoped this tough talk would cause Mexico to cower, but they didn't. By mid-March, Mexico rebuffed Slidell again and issued a statement that, quote, the sentiment of her own dignity will not allow her to consent to such ignominy. Through the spring of 1846, Polk discussed with his cabinet Atocha's proposal. His advisors were open to it. He then discussed obtaining the necessary $500,000 with members of Congress. Though several were also intrigued, Senator Calhoun informed Polk that it was too controversial a move and that Congress wouldn't fund the plan. For now, Polk shelved it, but his actions showed that he was seriously considering it. At this point, Polk was preparing for more aggressive measures. He ordered Taylor and his force, numbering about 3,500, to the Rio Grande River. In doing so, Taylor was unmistakably in territory disputed by the United States and Mexico. This order would reverberate throughout American history and fuel controversy about James Polk's legacy to this day. To many observers, both in the United States and Mexico, this was an act of war in itself. When Taylor arrived there on March 28, 1846, he was met by Generals Francisco Mejia and Pedro de Ampudia. Ampudia gave Taylor an ultimatum to leave or else, quote, arms and arms alone must decide the question. Taylor responded by blockading the mouth of the Rio Grande. A third Mexican general named Mariano Arista arrived. Taylor found himself outnumbered by more than 2-1. In the midst of the tension, 2 American officers were killed during a routine horseback ride. On April 25th, Arista's forces then ambushed a contingent of American soldiers, killing 11 of them. With that, the first shots of the Mexican-American War were fired. When word got back, Polk and his advisors drafted a message to Congress calling for a declaration of war. The message cited Arista's actions as well as the Slidell mission, but it also mentioned, quote, the long continued and unredressed wrongs and injuries committed by the Mexican government on citizens of the United States. Polk added, quote, now after reiterated menaces, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our country, and shed American blood upon American soil. In Polk's mind, Taylor's move into disputed territory was legitimate because Texas had successfully won it during its War of Independence, and after annexation, it was American territory. Mexico, who had never recognized that claim, saw Taylor's mission as an invasion. Not all Americans agreed with Polk. Senator Benton, perhaps embittered by how Texas was annexed, said America's claim never went past the Nueces River. Many others agreed and felt Polk's actions started the war. Still, as one finds throughout history, it is unpopular to oppose a war regardless of how it started, especially when a long list of grievances against the enemy had piled up over the years. By May, the House passed a resolution 173-14. In the Senate, it passed 40-2. James K. Polk, the former dark horse candidate, was now a wartime president. Did Polk want war from the beginning? It was clear he wanted to secure most of the continent for the United States. It seems that he really felt that Mexico, in its state of weakness and instability, and with all the money it owed America, would be willing to sell. But when it became clear that Mexico would not back down, Polk was not afraid of prosecuting war. The war had arrived, and it would define his presidency. That war and its legacy for our nation will be the subject of our next episode. This American President is produced by myself, Richard Lim, and Michael Neal. Thanks to my dad, Bert Chu. The music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. We also want to thank our Patreon supporters. You too can support us by going to patreon.com/thisamericanpresident and giving any amount you choose per episode that we release. If you like what you've been hearing, you can also help us by sharing an episode on Twitter or Facebook. I'm Richard Lim. We're back next time with more This American President.